guys, so in this video we're going to be talking about the diminished scale. Essentially what it is, how to use it, and then a couple sort of interesting points or features of the diminished scale. Now, as you'd expect, the diminished scale is very much related to the diminished chord as well as a couple other chords, all of which I'll go through sort of later in this video. But first I want to touch on a couple interesting things about the diminished scale. So firstly, it's an octatonic scale, which essentially means it has 8 notes rather than 7 notes like you'd find in your sort of usual diatonic scales. And secondly, it is a symmetrical scale, and essentially all that means is the intervals between the notes sort of repeat in a cycle. And in the case of a diminished scale, we're repeating the cycle semitone tone, semitone tone, semitone tone, semitone tone. But again, I am going to go into that in a little bit more detail later on. Now, because the diminished scale is a symmetrical scale, there are only 3 possible diminished scales which can exist on the piano or in music. Essentially, because of the way that the diminished scale is structured, this half step, whole step structure, it effectively means that the C diminished scale is exactly the same as the E flat diminished scale, which is exactly the same as the G flat diminished scale, which is exactly the same as the A diminished scale. So as you can see, those 4 notes outline the diminished chord, but as I just said, what that effectively means is that there are only 3 possible different diminished scales, and they're essentially ones that begin on the C, the B, or the B flat. Diminished scale starting from any other note is essentially just a repetition of one of those 3 diminished scales. But again, that'll make more sense as we go on. Now, in jazz, we differentiate between 2 types of diminished scales, which are effectively just modes of the diminished scale, in the same way that D Dorian is just a mode of C major, which in effect means that the D Dorian scale is really just the C major scale starting and ending on a different note. Now, the first scale or mode of the diminished scale is known as the half-whole diminished scale, or otherwise known as the dominant diminished scale. Now, it's called the half-whole diminished scale because starting from your root note, you move up in intervals of half a step, then a whole step, half a step, then a whole step, half a step, then a whole step, half a step, and then a whole step. So if we were to play C half-whole diminished scale, we would have the notes C, D flat, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, A, B flat, C. Now, if we were to build up the chord associated with this C half-whole diminished scale, then we would get the chord C13, flat 9, sharp 9, sharp 11, which is usually just shortened to C7, flat 9. Now, while prima facie, if you have a look at this scale, it looks like it has a minor third. If you've seen my lesson on why you can use different scales over the same chord, you'll know that if a scale has both a minor third and a major third, then the major third is actually the real third, and the minor third is actually a sharp 9. Now, there is an underlying sort of theoretical reason for that, but I'm not going to go into it here. So that means, just to sort of show you more concretely, if we build up a chord only using the notes of the C half-whole diminished scale, starting from the C, going up in thirds, we get the C, the E, the G, a B flat, and that's what makes it a dominant chord, right? A major third and a flat 7th. Then we get the D flat, which is a flat 9, the D sharp, which is a sharp 9, the F sharp, which is a sharp 11, and then the A, which is a 13. But again, like I just mentioned, that is generally shortened to a C7 flat 9 just because it's much easier to read than C13, flat 9, sharp 11. So this now means that the half-whole diminished scale can be used over a dominant 7 chord. In this case, for example, C7. It's got a nice kind of like exotic, almost like snake charmer-y type of sound. So if, for example, we were playing a 2-5-1 in the key of F major, so we would go G minor 7 to C7 to F major 7. Over the G minor 7 you would play F major or G Dorian. Over the C7 you can play the C half-whole diminished scale. And then back to the F major over the F major 7. And then in the same way that you can substitute in that half-whole diminished scale over the C7, in that little chord progression, you can also substitute in the related chord. So you could go G minor 7 to C7 flat 9 to F major 7. So hopefully now you understand and can see the thing I mentioned earlier, that the C half-whole diminished scale is exactly the same as the E flat half-whole diminished scale, which is exactly the same as the G flat half-whole diminished scale, and which is exactly the same as the A half-whole diminished scale. Now the second diminished scale or mode is the exact opposite of the first and is known as the whole half diminished scale. And that's, again, starting from the root note, because it goes up in intervals of whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Now that scale I played was the D flat whole half diminished scale, and hopefully you see that it was exactly the same as the C half whole diminished scale. And this is what I mean by it's effectively just a mode of the diminished scale, in the same way that D Dorian is exactly the same as C major, just starting from a different note. The D flat whole half diminished scale is exactly the same as the C half-whole diminished scale, just starting from a different note. Now the chord associated with the D flat whole half diminished scale is the D flat diminished chord. Now notice that it's not a D flat 7 chord. The scale associated with a D flat 7 would be the D flat half whole diminished scale, but instead we're playing the D flat whole half diminished scale. And the reason this is important is that notice that the third note of the D flat 7 chord is an F. Now we don't have an F in the D flat whole half diminished chord. We have an F sharp, so therefore it can't fit over this D flat 7 chord. So in effect what that means is that if you're playing a piece of music and you come across a D flat diminished chord, you can play the D flat whole half diminished scale over the top. Now, as I just mentioned, the D flat whole half diminished scale is exactly the same as the C half whole diminished scale. And you'll find that a very common chord substitute for a C dominant 7 or a dominant 7 chord is in fact the D flat diminished chord. And that's because effectively if you play C7 flat 9 and you get rid of the C, you have a D flat diminished chord, right? You can move that down there. So a D flat diminished chord is effectively a rootless C7 flat 9 chord, so it acts as a chord substitute. So now, just like we can build up the associated chord with every single note in the C major scale, namely being C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G7, A minor 7, B half diminished, we can do the exact same thing with the diminished scale. So if we take the C half whole diminished scale, the associated chords with each one of those notes are effectively C7, D flat diminished, D sharp 7, E diminished, F sharp 7, G diminished, A7, B flat diminished, and then back to C7. Now, an interesting and an incredibly useful fact about the diminished scale is that there are no avoid notes. And what that means is that all the chords are completely interchangeable. Now, what that means in practice is that if I play this chord here, which has the notes D flat, E, G, B flat, this chord can be a D flat diminished, an E diminished, a G diminished, a B flat diminished, a C7 flat 9, a D sharp 7 flat 9, an F sharp 7 flat 9, or an A7 flat 9. So this chord shape here can effectively be 8 different chords. So you're really getting 8 chords for the price of one, which I think is not too shabby. And so that means the actual specific chord that you're playing depends entirely on what note you play in the bass. If you play a C in the bass, you have a C7 flat 9. If you play a D flat in the bass, you have a D flat diminished chord. If you play a D sharp in the bass, you have a D sharp 7 flat 9 chord. And so on. Now, because there are no avoid notes in the diminished scale, that means there are a couple other really cool things you can do with this scale. So firstly, let's take the D flat diminished chord again. So we've got the notes D flat, E, G, B flat. Now, if you increase any one of those notes by one tone, you still remain within the diminished scale. And therefore, you're still playing effectively a diminished chord. However, by doing so, you dramatically increase the tension or the dissonance of that chord. And so you get a very different sound. But because you're still staying within the diminished scale, it's perfectly fine to do as effectively a substitute chord. So again, if we play that D flat diminished chord, so we can move that D flat up to become a D sharp. And it sounds much more dissonant. Or again, we can make the E become an F sharp, or the G become an A, or the B flat become a C. Right, so all of those variants are perfectly legitimate substitutes of regular diminished chords, and they're much more dissonant and create a lot more tension. So you can easily throw that in if you want to create a really sort of dark and dissonant sound in whatever song that you're playing. Now, the other really cool thing you can do is something called a double diminished chord. Now, if you were paying close attention, you would have noticed that the diminished scale is effectively just two diminished chords superimposed over the top of each other. So for example, the C half whole diminished scale is really just the C diminished chord and the D flat diminished chord superimposed over the top of each other. So that means, again, because there are no avoid notes, you can play a D flat diminished chord in your left hand and a C diminished chord in your right hand. And that is called a double diminished chord. Now that is a monster of a chord, and it's really menacing and it's really dissonant. And technically that chord is a C13 flat 9 sharp 9 sharp 11, D sharp 13 flat 9 sharp 9 sharp 11, F sharp 13 flat 9 sharp 9 sharp 11, and A13 flat 9 sharp 9 sharp 11. So if you're playing a song and you come across a dominant 7 chord and you want to create a hell of a lot of tension and a hell of a lot of dissonance, you can play this double diminished chord. And probably scare the crap out of everyone, but it's a perfectly fine dominant 7 sort of extension or substitute chord that sounds really great and really dark and really menacing and ominous. Cool, so that's about it for the diminished scale. Hopefully you found this interesting and useful. As always, feel free to leave any comments or questions below. Thanks guys, see ya.